The rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking Adana to the bone as she stood outside the grand iron gates of the Obianwu mansion. She shivered, clutching the small bundle of clothes she had managed to grab before being thrown out. The night was dark, the sky heavy with storm clouds, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The world had never felt so cruel. Moments ago, she had been inside that very house, scrubbing the marble floors, polishing the golden chandeliers, and serving the wealthy family that never once acknowledged her existence beyond commands and insults. She had been nothing more than a shadow in that home, a poor maid who had no voice, no power, and no escape. Until tonight. Madame Ifeoma, the mistress of the house, had always looked at her with thinly veiled disdain. Adana was too young, too pretty, too much of a threat, she supposed. It didn't matter that Adana had never so much as lifted her eyes to Madame Ifeoma's husband or sons. Jealousy was a poison that required no proof, only suspicion. And tonight, that poison had spilled over. The accusation had come like a slap. "You wretched girl! How dare you try to seduce my son?" Madame Ifeoma had screamed, her voice shrill with anger. Adana had barely been able to protest before a stinging slap landed across her cheek. She had gasped in pain, clutching her face as Madame Ifeoma's eldest son, Chika, stood in the corner, watching silently. He had been the one who had been chasing after her, following her into the kitchen, trying to touch her when no one was looking. She had resisted, always found ways to escape his grasp, but tonight, he had taken it too far. Chika had cornered her in the storage room, pressing his weight against her, his breath hot and reeking of alcohol. Adana had fought him off, pushing him away with all the strength she had. He had stumbled back, knocking over a shelf of expensive wine bottles. The sound had been deafening, the crash alerting the entire household. When the servants and Madame Ifeoma arrived, Chika had done what cowards always did, he lied. "She tried to force herself on me," he had said, his voice steady despite the guilt in his eyes. "She grabbed me first." Madame Ifeoma needed no further convincing. A poor maid against her son. It was no contest. Adana had barely had time to defend herself before the guards were called. "Pack your things and get out." Madame Ifeoma had spat. "You think I'll let a desperate little village girl ruin my family?" And just like that, Adana was cast out. No severance pay, no place to go, nothing but the rain and the cold night air. She hugged herself, feeling the sting of betrayal settle deep in her chest. Where would she go? She had no family in the city. Her mother had died years ago, and her father had left when she was just a child. She had come to the city with nothing but hope and had now lost even that. Lightning flashed, illuminating the empty streets. She turned and walked away from the mansion, her feet splashing through puddles, her stomach empty, her future uncertain. She wandered the city streets, shivering as the night grew colder. She passed closed shops, darkened alleyways, and the occasional street vendor packing up their goods for the night. The city was alive with lights and movement, but she felt completely invisible. As she reached a bus stop, she sank onto the bench, hugging herself tightly. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in her life. "Excuse me, are you all right?" The voice was deep, smooth, and filled with quiet concern. Adana lifted her head, blinking against the rain. A man stood before her, holding a large black umbrella over his head. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a sharp, well-tailored suit. Even in the dim streetlights, Adana could see that he was incredibly handsome. His skin was a rich ebony, his features striking, and his dark eyes studied her with something that looked like curiosity and kindness. Adana hesitated. She had learned the hard way that men with money often saw poor girls like her as nothing more than playthings. She had no reason to trust him. But something in his gaze made her pause. He was different. "You're shivering," he noted, his eyes scanning her drenched clothes. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather." "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He was silent for a moment, then exhaled softly. "Come with me." Adana's heart pounded. She should say no. She should keep walking, find a shelter, figure things out on her own. But she was exhausted, hungry, and freezing. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wary. He smiled slightly, as if he understood her hesitation. "My name is Kenechukwu. And I just want to help." She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. But all she saw was sincerity. And so, with nothing left to lose, Adana made the choice that would change her life forever. She took his outstretched hand and stepped into the unknown. Adana hesitated before slipping her cold fingers into Kenechukwu's warm hand. The contrast was startling. Her skin was wet and trembling, while his was steady and firm, a silent reassurance in the middle of the storm. She didn't know him, didn't know where he intended to take her, but at that moment, she had no better option. With slow, cautious steps, she walked beside him as he led her away from the bus stop. His sleek black car was parked just a few feet away, shining under the dim glow of the street lights. It was the kind of car that only the wealthy could afford, the kind that men like Chika and his family rode in without a second thought. A lump formed in her throat. Was she making a mistake? Kenechukwu must have noticed her hesitation, because he stopped and turned to her. "I know you don't trust me," he said gently, his dark eyes meeting hers. "And I don't blame you. But I swear, I'm not here to hurt you." Adana swallowed hard, searching his face for any sign of deception. But there was none. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in a long time, genuine concern. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe," he replied. "You're soaked, you're shivering, and it's late. You need a warm place to sleep. I have a guest house you can stay in for the night." A guest house? The idea seemed almost laughable. People like him had entire extra houses just sitting empty, while people like her had nowhere to lay their heads. But as the wind howled around them, and another crack of thunder rumbled overhead, she realized she didn't have much of a choice. "Okay," she whispered, stepping closer. Kenechukwu gave a small nod and opened the car door for her. She slid inside, the warmth of the car wrapping around her like a blanket. The scent of expensive leather and faint cologne filled her nose, a stark contrast to the damp, musty smell of the servants' quarters she had been used to. Kenechukwu got into the driver's seat and started the engine, guiding the car smoothly through the rain-soaked streets. For the first few minutes, silence filled the air between them. Adana kept her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing. Who was this man? Why was he helping her? "You don't have to be afraid," he said after a while, his voice low and calm. "I don't expect anything in return. I saw you sitting there, looking lost, and I couldn't leave you like that." Adana turned her head to look at him. "Most people wouldn't stop," she murmured. He gave a small smile, his eyes never leaving the road. "Most people don't care to look." His words lingered in her mind. It was true. She had spent years in a house full of people who saw her every day, but never really looked at her. The drive didn't take long. Soon, Kenechukwu turned into a gated compound, nodding at the security guard who quickly opened the gates for him. The car rolled down a paved driveway, past a beautifully landscaped garden, and a house that looked like something out of a magazine. But instead of stopping in front of the main house, he continued toward a smaller, but equally elegant building nestled behind it. "This is the guest house," he said, pulling the car to a stop. Adana's mouth went dry. This guest house was bigger than any home she had ever lived in. Kenechukwu got out first, walking around to open the door for her. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand again. She stepped out cautiously, still unsure of what she had gotten herself into. The moment they entered the house, warmth embraced her. Soft lighting, polished floors, and a cozy living room greeted her. Everything looked pristine, as if it had been prepared for someone far more important than a former maid with nothing but a small bundle of clothes. "You can stay here tonight," Kenechukwu said, leading her inside. "There's a bathroom down the hall, and I'll bring you some dry clothes. The kitchen is stocked if you're hungry." Adana blinked up at him, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." His words surprised her. A man like him, rich, powerful, and dressed in designer suits, knew what it was like to have nothing. It seemed impossible, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of old pain, that told her he wasn't lying. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Get some rest, Adana." She watched as he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. For the first time that night she felt safe. Alone in the room, Adana peeled off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in the soft, warm towel she found in the bathroom. When she finally crawled into the plush bed, she felt like she was floating. She had never slept in anything so comfortable before. And yet sleep didn't come easily. Her mind raced with everything that had happened just hours ago. She had been cast out like garbage, unwanted and unloved, and now she was in a house so grand she could hardly believe it was real. But what did it all mean? Was Kenechukwu truly just a kind stranger, or had she stepped into a world far more complicated than she could imagine? As she drifted into a restless sleep, one thing was certain: her life would never be the same again. Adana woke to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the curtains. For a moment she forgot where she was, the warmth of the bed, the fresh scent of lavender in the air. It all felt so different from the cold, hard floors she had been used to. Then reality settled in. She was in a stranger's home, a rich stranger's home. Vaulting upright, she looked around the unfamiliar room. The bed was large and covered in soft white linen. The furniture was polished and expensive, far beyond anything she had ever owned. She almost felt out of place, like she was trespassing in a life that didn't belong to her. Her stomach growled, a painful reminder that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Slowly she slipped out of bed, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. Kenechukwu had said the kitchen was stocked, but was she really allowed to take anything? She hesitated before finally pushing the door open and stepping out into the hallway. The house was eerily silent. Following the soft scent of food, she made her way toward the kitchen, and there, standing by the stove, was Kenechukwu. He was dressed in a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, nothing like the sharply dressed man she had met the night before. He looked almost normal. "You awake?" he said, turning to her with a small smile. "I wasn't sure when you'd get up." Adana shifted awkwardly. I hope I didn't oversleep." "You didn't," he assured her. "I figured you'd be exhausted after everything that happened." Her eyes darted to the food on the table, toast, eggs, and a steaming cup of tea. It was simple, yet more than she had ever expected. "Sit," Kenechukwu said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You should eat." Hunger won over hesitation, and Adana slid into the chair. The first bite of toast melted on her tongue, and she had to stop herself from eating too quickly. Kenechukwu watched her with quiet amusement. You don't have to rush, there's plenty. She slowed down, embarrassment creeping into her cheeks. I'm just not used to this. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes studying her. Used to what? Kindness, she admitted. A shadow crossed his face. That's a shame. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After a few moments, Kenechukwu spoke again. What's your plan, Adana? She blinked. Plan? Yes, do you have anywhere to go, anyone who can help you? She lowered her gaze to her plate. No, I have no one. His jaw tightened slightly. Then what will you do? Adana swallowed the lump in her throat. She had no answers. The only thing she was sure of was that she couldn't go back to the life she had before. I don't know, she admitted. Kenechukwu sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't usually do things like this, but he exhaled sharply before continuing. You can stay here for a while. Her head snapped up. What? I'm not throwing you out onto the streets, he said firmly. You can stay here until you figure things out. Adana stared at him, disbelief flooding her mind. Why was he doing this? What did he want in return? Why are you helping me? She asked cautiously. His expression darkened slightly, as if the question touched something deep inside him, but then he shook his head. Let's just say I know what it's like to have nothing. She wanted to ask more, to understand who he really was, but something in his tone told her not to push. Thank you, she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. Kenechukwu gave a small nod before standing. There are clothes for you in the guest room. I'll arrange for you to get some essentials later. Adana's breath hitched. He had already thought about her comfort. You don't have to do all this, she murmured. I know, he said simply before walking away. A life she never imagined. Over the next few days, Adana settled into the guest house. Kenechukwu had provided her with clothes, toiletries, and even a small phone in case she needed anything. She wasn't sure if she should be grateful or suspicious. It felt too good to be true. She knew that in life, nothing came for free. People always expected something in return. But Kenechukwu never made any demands. He barely even stayed around long enough for them to talk. He was always busy, always on the phone, always dealing with something important. She spent most of her time in the guest house, unsure of what to do with herself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't scrubbing floors or serving a master. She had food, clothes, and a safe place to sleep. But she also had an uneasy feeling in her chest. Was this temporary? Would he change his mind one day and throw her out? She needed to figure out her future. And then, one evening, an opportunity presented itself. A new purpose. Adana was in the kitchen washing dishes when she overheard Kenechukwu talking to someone outside. His voice was tense, irritated. I need someone reliable, he was saying. Someone who can manage things properly, not the incompetent fools I keep hiring. Adana hesitated. Was he talking about work? A bold idea formed in her mind. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out onto the patio where Kenechukwu stood, his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw her, he raised an eyebrow. Hold on, he told the person on the line before lowering his phone. Everything okay? Adana swallowed her nerves. I heard you say you needed someone reliable. His gaze sharpened. Yes? She took a deep breath. Let me work for you. His eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected that. You want a job? She nodded firmly. I don't want to be a burden. You've done too much already. But I can work. I know how to manage things. I can clean, organize, help with whatever you need. He stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. "You're not afraid of hard work, are you?" She met his gaze with determination. "No, I'm not." Kenechukwu nodded, impressed. "All right then. Let's see what you can do." And just like that, Adana took the first step toward reclaiming her life. Adana's first few weeks working for Kenechukwu were nothing short of a whirlwind. She was eager to prove herself, and the billionaire gave her the space to do so. At first, she focused on organizing his office, cleaning up the various files, and making sure his meetings went smoothly. She wasn't given any major responsibilities yet, but every day she could see how much he relied on her to keep things in order. She had expected a bit of resistance after all. She was a poor maid, thrown out of her old life, but Kenechukwu had been nothing but supportive. He never treated her as inferior, never looked down on her. In fact, he seemed to appreciate her work ethic and her unwavering determination. One day, as she was wiping down the desk in his office, Kenechukwu came in, holding a stack of documents. He placed them on the desk with a sigh. "I've been meaning to hire someone for this task, but I've just been too busy to get around to it." Adana looked up from her work, a bit puzzled. "What kind of task?" she asked. "I need someone to handle a new project," he said, running his hand through his hair. "There's a potential investment opportunity, but I need someone I can trust to do the groundwork. Someone reliable, not someone who just wants the paycheck." Adana's heart skipped a beat. Was this an opportunity for her to prove herself even more? "I'm your person," she said without thinking. Kenechukwu raised an eyebrow, his gaze thoughtful. "You're sure? It's a lot of responsibility. This project is huge, and it could determine whether or not my company expands into international markets. You wouldn't be just cleaning or organizing. This is real work." Adana nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I can handle it." He studied her for a long moment, and then, with a slow smile, he handed her the documents. "All right. We'll see how you do." Kenechukwu turned his gaze to her, his dark eyes intense. "Because you remind me of myself. I didn't start out with money or power. I started with nothing, just like you. But I worked hard. I pushed myself. And I made sure I never lost sight of what mattered: my integrity, my values." Adana was speechless. She had never expected this kind of vulnerability from him. "You don't have to explain," she whispered. "I understand." He nodded, and the room fell into a comfortable silence once more. A few more months passed, and with each day, Adana grew more confident in her role. The project she had been working on had become a success, and Kenechukwu had made the decision to move forward with the international expansion. He had told her that her work had made all the difference. She had proven herself, and now she was an integral part of his business. But even as she became more comfortable with her new life, a part of her still felt unsure. She had never allowed herself to believe that something like this true success could last. She feared the day when the rug would be pulled out from under her. And yet, Kenechukwu kept encouraging her, telling her that she had a future ahead of her, one that was far brighter than she had ever imagined. One evening, as they were having dinner together, Kenechukwu looked at her with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "Adana," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "there's something I need to say." She set her fork down, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. "What was this about?" "I've been thinking about you a lot lately," he continued. "And I've come to realize something." You've become a part of my life in ways I never expected. You're not just an employee anymore. You've become someone I care about. Adana blinked, unable to find the right words. Kenechukwu. He reached across the table and took her hand. I know this is unexpected, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you. I think you know what I'm talking about. I want you to stay by my side. Not just for business, but for something more. Adana's heart skipped a beat. This was everything she had dreamed of and feared in equal measure. She had spent so long keeping herself guarded, never allowing anyone to get too close. But here was Kenechukwu, offering her something real. She started, but her words caught in her throat. He smiled softly, understanding her hesitation. Take your time. I'm not rushing you. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. In the months that followed, Adana and Kenechukwu grew closer. She realized that the fear she had once had about losing everything was slowly dissipating. She had built a new life, one that was far from perfect, but full of possibilities. She had found love, found herself, and most importantly, had found the courage to live a life of her own choosing. And in the end, she realized that true power didn't lie in wealth or status. It lay in the connections we build, in the choices we make, and in the strength to rise from the ashes of our past. With Kenechukwu by her side, Adana knew that she had a future, one that was hers to create. The end of this story marks a new beginning for Adana, a future where she could walk with pride, knowing that she had overcome the obstacles of her past and had built something real and lasting.